What is up, everyone? Riley here, and today I'm going to talk about some recommendations of comics for manga readers, so stay tuned. Alright, everyone, so before we get talking about those comic recommendations for manga fans, I wanted to do a couple things. Number one, thank the new members of the Patreon family, Parker and Vatch. Thank you so much for joining in the Patreon family and joining in on the love here. If you are a fan of what I do on this channel, like these guys are, then there's a link down below where you too can become a patron to my channel and help me to make this channel better and better. Anything helps, and the more help I get, the better content that I can make on a regular basis here. So check out the link down below. It'll show you all the cool stuff that you'll get access to. You get notes for the videos that I make, you'll get some exclusive video content over there, and then I'm going to start doing monthly live streams on there just to have fun and hang out with the viewers of my channel and stuff. So check that out. And then also the second thing I wanted to mention, of course, don't forget to check out the other channel that I'm on, the Omnibus Collectors Network. I join a bunch of other awesome YouTubers, and on that channel every week there's like 3 or 4 different shows that we do. And we talk about comics, manga, movies, video games, all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of fun that we have over there. Go over there, check it out, subscribe, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel here right now so you can be part of the Omnibus Collector family. And without further ado, let's get into the topic at hand. So we're talking today about comic recommendations for manga readers. Now, one of the biggest goals for my channel is that I want to help readers to discover and try new things that they may not have otherwise thought to have read. So usually this means that I'm going to be talking about manga that manga readers are going to try for the first time, or talk about comics that comic readers haven't tried before. But I also want to help to bridge that gap between the two media. Because while there are a lot of differences between comics and manga and European comics and stuff, at the core, it's all just comics. It's all just graphic literature. It's all sequential storytelling with pictures on a page and some words. And so I know there's a lot of people who are already a fan of all of the above, but there's a lot of people who may have hesitance in crossing that bridge to who already read manga to, you know, try Western comics, or who already read Western comics to try manga. So I wanted to try and make some videos that talk about the two and how to help people to cross that bridge and start trying new things that they haven't tried before. But I don't want to ignore the differences between the media. I don't want to ignore the things that make each one of these medium individual. What makes comics a comics and what makes manga manga. So before talking about any recommendations on what books to read and how to kind of get into it, I think that it's really important that I address a lot of those differences, because oftentimes it's those differences that cause readers to hesitate in trying something new. So primarily, there are 3 easily identifiable differences that anyone could spot just by walking into a bookstore and glancing at their comics and manga section. These aren't the big ones that I want to address, but I just kind of want to get them out of the way. Firstly, manga primarily read from right to left, whereas Western comics read from left to right. Now I say primarily because there are some examples of things like the manga Levius is printed in Japan left to right on purpose, or some translated comics like Ranma 1/2 in English is a left to right reading book. They flip the artwork for the English adaptation. Most things now are not flipped like that, but that was a common thing before. The second difference here that I'm talking about is that almost all manga is presented in black and white. There are examples of manga that are in color, and there are also, you know, a lot of manga have special colored pages and stuff like that, but primarily it's in black and white, whereas primarily comic books are in color. And I know that there's also plenty of examples of black and white comics, a lot of independent series, a lot of popular stuff like The Walking Dead, Ninja Turtles, Usagi Yojimbo. These are all examples of black and white comics, but primarily Western comics are fully colored. And then the third and final of these small, easily discernible differences is the small digest-sized books that most manga come in. Most manga, you can see all the stuff behind me, come in these smaller paperbacks, whereas the standard size of a Western comic is the same size as pretty much the largest manga print that we'll get, which would be, examples would be like the Attack on Titan Colossal Editions, Sailor Moon Eternal Editions, or the Berserk and Hellsing hardcovers from Dark Horse. Those are some of the largest printed manga that we get, but they're the same size as just a standard hardcover, a standard paperback of a Western comic. In Western comics, of course, they have oversized hardcovers and omnibus editions, absolute editions, artist editions, and all kinds of larger sized books that we really don't get in manga in those kinds of sizes. Now, there are exceptions and examples and stuff of larger things, but that's just speaking on the general differences, those small, easily identifiable differences. But it's the larger differences that I want to focus on, because those are the ones that I think become detractors for manga fans to try and read comics, and the other way around. And I'm looking kind of at the differences that are really prevalent when it comes to superhero comics from Marvel and DC, and the practices of the publishers themselves. Now, a lot of incoming new customer traffic for comics comes from people seeing the movies or the TV shows and being interested in checking out the source material. This is also true for manga as well, with people being interested in a series after enjoying the anime. However, with a manga, it's a lot simpler for someone who enjoyed the Demon Slayer anime to walk into a bookstore and pick out a Demon Slayer comic, because there's just one series, and it's easy to understand that you start from volume 1 and just move forward from there. It's not quite as simple when it comes to Western comics. Now, let's say someone walked into a bookstore because they watched the most recent Spider-Man movie and they wanted to read some Spider-Man comics. They walk in and they're going to be met with hundreds of books. Now, this is just, let's say that this bookstore in particular has every Spider-Man comic that's in print available on their shelves. There's going to be hundreds of books from dozens of different series, dozens of different creators, and some of them are not even going to be all the Spider-Man that this person would be familiar with. It's really overwhelming. So how do you know where to start? There's dozens of first volumes with dozens of first issues. So do you need to go back to the very beginning? Do you have to read issue number 1 from the 60s? Or what? Do you work forward from there? Do you start from somewhere else? Where do you read stuff like Spectacular Spider-Man? If you're reading Amazing Spider-Man, when do you weave in the secondary and tertiary Spider titles along that read? And that's not even mentioning one-shots and miniseries and all kinds of other stuff that Spider-Man's involved in, and all the team books that he's on. It's a lot. And for anyone that's new to the medium, it's obviously overwhelming to the point that many people are just going to want to give up before they even start. So what's important to understand here, and this is notes for people that are manga readers that want to read comics, it's important to understand the concept of a run. Each character or team's title are made up of many different runs by different creative teams. And I'm talking about the long-running stuff, like Justice League, Avengers, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, stuff like that. Those creative teams each have the duty of creating a story that can be a fresh start for the character and for new readers, while also expanding off of previous stories from other creative teams in a way that doesn't turn away those new readers. But it also has to kind of strategically make references to the older stories, because the publisher wants to entice new readers to go back and pick up older stories. So for example, the current Amazing Spider-Man run is by writer Nick Spencer. And Nick Spencer's done a great job of making a series that is very new reader friendly. You can pick up issue number 1 and go from there easily. It does reference back to a lot of older characters and older villains and older storylines, to the point that when you're reading it, a new reader might look at that and say, oh, I'm enjoying this story arc, and it's mentioning Kraven's Last Hunt, or this story arc is mentioning the death of Jean DeWolf. And that causes those readers, those new readers, to go and want to pick up those older books. And this isn't something that manga typically has to deal with. Usually in manga, one series is written by a single author for the duration of its run. So if you take long-running manga examples like One Piece and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, they've both been going for quite a while, but the same creator, Eiichiro Oda and Hirohiko Araki, have been attached to those series from the beginning, and they will remain attached to those series until they end. And this is a lot more like when you're looking at creator-owned or independent comics in the West, where one creator or one creative team is typically attached to that series for the duration of its run. And there are examples like Spawn, where other creators come in to tell stories using those characters, but typically it's one creator or one creative team who works on these creator-owned or independent titles throughout the entirety of their existence. And these independent titles have been getting a lot more popular as we've seen a lot of TV shows and movies that start to be based on these series. A great example being The Walking Dead, that had a really successful and really popular TV series that led a lot of readers to go check out the Walking Dead comics. And I think that right here lies a great entry point for manga readers to make their first steps into reading Western comics. Now, I don't think that it's a great idea to make that deep dive into the world of superheroes, looking at stuff like Spider-Man or Batman immediately, but it's probably better to ease in by reading independent series, so you're becoming more familiar with the differences in writing styles between the manga and the Western comics, the difference in their art styles, and then you start becoming more familiar with creators themselves, which you'll want to start following because there's a lot of creators that you're going to start liking, and it's an easy way to find new books is by looking at the other titles that those creators have worked on. Now, you could deep dive into the superhero stuff right off the bat, and that's fine, and I do plan on detailing that kind of recommendation in a further video, but today I just wanted to explore the less mainstream options and kind of ease people's way into reading the superhero and mainstream type comics. So let's get started on those recommendations. Now, like I said, I'm hoping to help people to ease into reading Western comics, and I'm not only looking at independent books first, but there are a bunch of independent and creator-owned comic series that are purposefully made to kind of have a similar appearance to, or a similar vibe to, manga. There's a lot of different series like this, like Adam Warren's Empowered series, or Corey Lewis's Shark Knife. And some of these series are even published at manga publishers. Like, for instance, Tokyo Pop has a ton of different series that are written and created by Western creators, such as Keith Giffen's I Love Halloween series over at Tokyo Pop, or the King City series from Brandon Graham, which eventually got re-released by Image. But I wanted to look at a really popular one today, probably the most popular example of one of these series, and that is Brian Lee O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim. So Scott Pilgrim's very popular, and of course it had a film adaptation that a ton of people watched and a ton of people loved, directed by Edgar Wright, starring Michael Cera in the titular role. But before the film, it was a comic, and it was a very manga-inspired comic. Now, I have the special colored edition hardcovers in my collection, but originally the series was published across 6 paperback editions that were black and white, and were made to look like a volume of manga. They looked so much like manga that a lot of stores would inadvertently carry them in their manga section. And at the back, if you turn to the last page, even though it read from left to right like a Western book, at the very end of the book, there would be a page saying, "Stop, you're reading the wrong way," because it looked like a manga series. So they're making a joke on those things that you'll find in a lot of volumes of manga. Now, the series itself follows the titular character of Scott Pilgrim. He's a pretty average dude, doesn't really have much going on with his life, and then one day he meets a girl named Ramona, and he immediately wants to date this girl. But he finds out that in order to date Ramona, he has to fight against her 7 evil exes. So it starts out with this kind of normal slice of life type vibe, and then it quickly develops into more of the action that you would find from a shonen series. So it is a great mash of 2 popular genres of manga, with the shonen action and the slice of life. And it also includes a lot of really awesome references and jokes that go back to a lot of Japanese geek culture, like manga, anime, and video games. So if you're like me and you're into any of those things, this is a really easy series to kind of jump into, an easier way into becoming more familiar with Western comics. It's also a series that's particularly cheap to find. If you want to just get the paperback editions, I think you can get the whole 6-volume set for around $30. So it's a really cheap investment to make, and I think that this is great because it opens the door to other series like itself that I was mentioning, which are very inspired by manga, but also you can start exploring more work by Brian Lee O'Malley. So from there, he's got other graphic novels like Seconds and Lost at Sea, and then as well as those, you can check out his ongoing comic over at Image, Snot Girl. Now from there's tons of other independent comics out there, tons of other series that you can check out, especially from Image and stuff like that, who have a ton of great comics by a lot of great creators. But I want to kind of make this as we're easing towards superhero comics. So in that, I think the next step would be to retain that familiarity that Scott Pilgrim has, in that you're reading something about kind of a genre, I guess, that you're familiar with. If you're familiar with anime, you're familiar with manga and stuff like that. But it has a distinctly Western twist. And that is the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers from Kyle Higgins over at Boom. Now, again, I have the nice hardcover edition. This is available across a series of paperbacks that are a lot cheaper and a lot easier to find. But I'm recommending Power Rangers because as is popularly known, the Power Rangers series was based on the Japanese Super Sentai series. The original Power Rangers series in the US was based off of, I think it was the 14th Sentai series, Kyoryu Zeo Ranger, which, when brought to the US, they replaced all of the Japanese actors with American actors, but they still retained the Sentai aspects and the mecha aspects and the kaiju aspects. So these 3 aspects of the series are retained in the American version, and they are present in the comic version as well, that kind of give you something that is relatable and easy to keep grasping onto, and plus everyone knows Power Rangers. Power Rangers is just a household thing. But it allows you those Western sensibilities in the way that the story is told, because it is a superhero team, and it is told by a superhero comic writer. Kyle Higgins is known for stuff like his Nightwing run over at DC. So this is something that I think kind of begins to familiarize readers with more of what you'd expect from Western superhero comics, but not diving deep into this existing world of superhero comics, like if you were to check out like a Batman comic or something like that. So it's an easy way to kind of get that vibe for how Western writers would write something that is a Eastern topic. It is a Japanese subject matter, but you can see the differences in how they would handle this. And it's a really fantastic series, really awesome character work. If you did grow up like me watching the old TV show, then it expands on that in really great ways that kind of embrace everything that we loved and that worked in those shows, while kind of stepping aside from all the cheesiness that when you watch those old Power Rangers episodes now, you're like, oh man, it's hard to watch. It really is. And an honorable mention real quick for another series that kind of in the same way uses those subject matters that you're going to be familiar with from being into Japanese culture, manga, anime, video games, all that stuff, but has a Western creator's twist on it, is a series called Kaiju Max, which I absolutely love, and I felt like I had to recommend it here because it's such a great series. But it's basically a prison drama about kaiju, giant monsters, who are kept on this Supermax prison in an island, and all the guards and the police and stuff like that are basically like Sentai or Ultraman type characters that keep them there and stuff like that. It's a fantastic series, great characters, fun artwork, and really awesome monsters that the creator Xander Cannon creates. They're kind of referencing back to kaiju like Godzilla and Gamera and stuff like that we are familiar with from the movies. Now from here we move into a straight up superhero title. I don't have the physical copies here because I read it digitally, but my next recommendation is Invincible by Robert Kirkman from Image Comics. Now Invincible is straight up superhero comics. So now we're stepping away from the familiar, we're stepping away from the things that kind of hold that grasp onto Japanese culture, and we're going into something that is fully embracing Western culture. And we're talking about a series that is focused on a superhero, so it lines up with the type of material that you would expect from, you know, mainstream hero comics like Marvel and DC, but this one's a lot easier to get into because it doesn't have you diving deep into that existing continuity of a universe like Marvel or DC that's existed for decades and has hundreds and hundreds of characters and villains and all this stuff and all these events that have happened in the past that the current storylines are kind of spinning off of, and instead you get this fresh start with a superhero series that feels like something like that and does have an expanded universe of spin-off titles, but it stands very well on its own because you don't have to worry about reading decades worth of material to understand, or at least you don't have to look up all of the major events and stuff online like on Wikipedia to understand what's going on in the current comics. Invincible follows a teenager who discovers that he has superpowers, and upon discovering his powers, he starts acting as a superhero. And the series kind of expands from there, and he learns more about the other superheroes are around him, and he gets involved working with superhero teams and working against villains. And there's a lot of really great character work here and drama between him and different characters and his family and all this stuff. And it makes for a really fantastic and really exciting superhero comic without all of the baggage that you would have from a hero comic from Marvel or DC. So I wanted to recommend this because it's a great step towards getting towards those superhero things and understanding kind of how those comics are written. And at this point, you have a really great understanding of the differences in how Western comics are written when compared to a manga series, but you're still having something that, for all intents and purposes, Invincible has a lot of those shonen manga tropes. Like, you're following a young high school aged guy who has superpowers. There are other people around him who have similar powers. There's bad guys. There are different arcs that have increasingly powerful threats throughout the series. It has a lot of stuff that is reminiscent to things that you might see from a manga series, something that you might see from like Naruto or Bleach, or some of those popular things, except instead of being about pirates like One Piece or ninja like Naruto, it's about superheroes. So I think this is a great recommendation. It also, again, lets you kind of get familiar with a creator. You become familiar with Robert Kirkman and his writing, and from there expand into reading other Kirkman material. So maybe you'll wind up wanting to read The Walking Dead, or maybe other stuff like Oblivion Song or Outcast, or some of his work that he did over at Marvel. And speaking of Marvel, my next recommendation, we're going right into a Marvel comic, but this one is one that's not once again, not held down by the baggage of continuity. It's something that is a really fresh start and a really great series for new readers who might want to read something that is in the Marvel Universe, but is not necessarily connected to the Marvel Universe at large. And that is Brian K. Vaughan's Runaways. Now, The Runaways does have a Hulu series that some people might be familiar with, so it is rather popular, and Brian K. Vaughan is a really popular writer in comics as well. He's done a lot of independent work and a lot of work over at DC and Vertigo. He's known for stuff like Saga and Y the Last Man, Ex Machina, Paper Girls, and stuff like that. And that's one of the great things about reading something like this is, once again, if you read something like Runaways and you find that you enjoy it, then you can kind of expand from there and read a bunch of other stuff that Brian K. Vaughan has written, like all those other titles that I was talking about. But the reason I want to recommend this one in particular is because the series, while it is part of the Marvel Universe, and it takes place in the Marvel Universe, and the characters interact a little bit with other heroes that exist in the Marvel Universe, it stands on its own, and it doesn't require you knowing a lot about, decades of history of these comics, because these are all characters that Brian K. Vaughan creates for this series. So the story follows a group of teenagers who every year get together because their parents do some sort of event, and they don't really know what that event is, but their parents bring them together, and the kids all hang out with each other during the time that the parents are busy. Now, one fateful year, the kids accidentally walk in and see what their parents are up to, and it just so happens that they're doing some sort of weird ritualistic sacrifice, and they freak out and they run, and hence the name The Runaways. Now, the kids at this point are like, well, we can't go back because what if our parents wind up just killing us? What do we do? Who do we talk to? We need to find out what it was that they were doing. And at this point, it's up to the kids to stop whatever it is that their parents are doing and kind of come to terms with the fact that their families are not so great. Their parents might be supervillains. So it's a fantastic series with an amazing cast of characters, great artwork, and once again, just like I was talking about with Invincible, I feel like even though this one is part of the Marvel Universe, it has a style and sensibility to it that would be familiar to someone who is already into manga, who's into shonen series and stuff. It has those teenage characters who form a group, they have villains that they go up against, they have this one journey that they're trying to complete, this one goal that they're trying to complete. It's something that would be a really easy read to kind of get into for someone who's familiar with manga. Now, Again, I'm showing the big old hardcover volume because I am the omnibus collector. I collect these omnibus editions, but the series is also available across a bunch of paperbacks, smaller hardcovers, and stuff like that. So what I would recommend is picking up the first complete collection paperback because it does have one complete story. It's the first 18-issue run written by Brian K. Vaughan. It has a beginning, has a middle, and it has a good ending, but it also ends with enough of a little cliffhanger that you might want to continue reading after that. It's also, I think, in print, so it shouldn't be too expensive to grab that book. It's a worthwhile investment, and it's a really good backdoor into kind of getting into more mainstream, more of the Marvel series or more superhero comics that exist more grounded and more influenced by the greater Marvel universe, the greater DC universe. And now, speaking of DC, I know my recommendations do not include any DC comics, and that's not because I dislike DC or anything. I have a large collection of DC comics, but in my opinion, there's a lot more new reader friendly material from Marvel, whereas a lot of the best DC material winds up being stuff that you kind of want to have understanding of the DC universe at large. And I mentioned before that I'll do another recommendation video where maybe I give some more recommendations of superhero comics and some DC series, and kind of help people to figure out how to get into those mainstream superhero comics, and talk about how I figured out how to go from being a manga reader into being a superhero comic reader. But my last recommendation is one more Marvel series, and that is Ultimate Spider-Man. So we've come full circle. I talked about how Spider-Man was so difficult to get into earlier in the video, and now I'm talking about a great and accessible Spider-Man comic that I think everyone should check out. Any fan of comics, manga, whatever, it's just a fantastic series. And again, I have to point out I have the big hardcover omnibus edition. There are paperback editions of this series, or the best way to read it is by going online and reading from Comixology. You can get cheap on there copies of the series, or you can go to the Marvel Unlimited app and subscribe to that. There's usually free trials, and you can try out Ultimate Spider-Man from there. So Ultimate Spider-Man is kind of the headlining series of the Ultimate Marvel Universe. And the idea behind the Ultimate Marvel Universe was that in the early 2000s, this new line of comics was launched that was a new universe untethered to the existing 616 Marvel Universe. That's the designation for the main Marvel Universe, is 616. And this was to create something that was a lot more new reader friendly, because a lot of the series from that time, you know, the Avengers titles that are coming out, the Spider-Man series that was coming out, all the different superhero comics that were coming out from Marvel at the time are very grounded in 40 plus years of continuity. At that point, it would have been around 40 years worth of continuity. And so Marvel came up with the idea of the Ultimate Universe and creating this new line of comics where new readers can look at this fresh take on these characters who are kind of updated for the modern times. So we get this new look at Peter Parker, who's updated for the 2000s. So it's a little dated at this point, given that was about 20 years ago, but it's something that still works really well for any new readers who are trying to get into comics now, because it introduces you, even though this is a different version of Peter and a new universe that's kind of starting from scratch, it introduces you to all of the same characters, the same heroes, the same supplemental cast, the same villains, just new versions of those characters. So you can start to have an understanding of who all of these characters are. And this is a great series to kind of get into and then eventually work your way into reading, you know, the mainline Spider-Man books. You have an understanding of who Spider-Man is, and even though it's a different version of Spider-Man, a different version of Peter Parker, you still kind of get who he is. And you could take that knowledge and definitely use it in reading some of the major storylines from the main Spider-Man books. But also, once again, I feel like this is a series that kind of mirrors a lot of those tropes from shonen manga, the stuff that you're used to reading in a shonen series. It's about a high schooler who gets superpowers, and he's sucked into this world full of heroes and villains and all this stuff, and it develops from there with a bunch of different story arcs, with a bunch of different characters and a bunch of different villains that he has to fight against. And it's something that sounds like, again, something that you might find in a manga series. And there was actually a Spider-Man manga series, but that's neither here nor there. But above all else, it's just a really fantastic comic, and it's a really easy read. And it's something that I feel like is probably the best place where, if you are a fan of manga and you want to read mainstream superhero comics, this is a fantastic starting point. It starts with a fresh new issue number 1, and it just goes forward for tons of issues. And at some point it does get renumbered, but by the time you get to there, you kind of know what to read, so it doesn't get too confusing. This also, if you're a fan of the Spider-Verse movie, is the series that would eventually, 10 plus years down the line, introduce us to the character of Miles Morales. And Miles has his own titles as well that are also pretty decent if you want to get another fresh start, but they do kind of spin out of this series, and it's not as new of a universe at that point. At the point that Miles is introduced, the Ultimate Marvel Universe has already been out for over a decade, so there's a lot of already developed characters and villains and stuff like that that exist. So that's why I recommend this one first. So anyway, those are my 5 recommendations, plus there was one honorable mention in there of a bunch of different series that manga readers can try out if they're wanting to get into Western comics. Now, like I mentioned before, this is the first in a series of different videos. Next, I'm going to do a video where I kind of flip it over, and I'm going to talk about manga that I recommend for Western comic readers. And then eventually I want to return to this idea and talk about more superhero comic recommendations, more, I guess, deep cuts when it comes to superhero comics that manga readers can jump into, and kind of how to get into reading those mainstream superhero books and what strategies I would recommend in finding what you like and finding the series that you like and the creators that you like, so you can start expanding your horizons with those superhero books. So anyway, that's all I got for today. Thank you so much for watching. I know this was a little bit longer of a video, but I hope that this video helps at least one person who has never read a Western comic before to finally try a Western comic. And I hope that it helps you in that journey in enjoying a lot of new material that you wouldn't have tried before. If I've got at least one person to do that, then this video is a success and it's done what I wanted it to do. So again, thank you for checking the video out with me. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit that subscribe button down below. Give it a like. Comment down below with any other comics that you would recommend for manga readers, manga you would recommend for comic readers, or any other videos like this that you would like to see me do. Any kind of how-to or helpful videos for whoever's out there that needs help with finding new things to read or finding a way to get into reading certain things. Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace out.